Let me start today with something that I want you to really sit with for a second, because I think most of you, and I include myself in this, have been looking at the global energy market through a completely outdated lens. And the reason we've been getting it wrong isn't because we don't pay attention. It's because the way energy security is being presented to the public is systematically designed to make you focus on the wrong variable. Everyone is watching tactical military strikes, tank movements, and political speeches while completely ignoring the physical architecture of global commerce. So here's what I want to do today. I want to take the headline everyone is panicking about, rising gas prices and naval deployments, and show you what is actually happening beneath the surface. A deliberate, two-pronged maritime containment strategy engineered to trigger a structural shock in the American economy.
Then, at the end of this analysis, I am going to give you 3 very specific, falsifiable predictions about what happens to global oil flows, fuel prices, and U.S. policy over the next 90 days, along with exact signals you can track yourself to verify whether this analysis holds up. That's the plan.
First, let's start with what happened over the last 48 hours. The United States Maritime Administration published an urgent emergency advisory for all commercial traffic operating in the Western Indian Ocean, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Southern Red Sea. And I want to be extremely precise here because the wording matters. This was not a routine security warning. This was a direct acknowledgement that the primary maritime transit arteries connecting Middle Eastern energy reserves to global markets are now operating under active asymmetric interdiction. At the exact same time, commercial AIS tracking data, the real-time positioning signal that every major cargo ship and supertanker broadcast showed over 40 ultra-large crude carriers altering course, dropping anchor, or idling outside key maritime choke points. Let me give you the exact numbers so you understand the scale of what we are looking at. The Strait of Hormuz handles approximately 20 to 21 million barrels of crude oil and refined petroleum products every single day. That is roughly 20% of the total global petroleum consumption and over 30% of all seaborne traded oil on planet Earth. Now add the second location, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow passage connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean, through which another 6 to 8 million barrels of crude and refined products pass daily, alongside nearly 12% of all global seaborne trade. When you combine those two geographic positions, you are looking at nearly 27 million barrels of daily oil flow. Over a quarter of human energy consumption funneling through 2 tiny, highly vulnerable maritime corridors. And right now, both of those corridors are being squeezed simultaneously. Does that make sense? Because it should not make sense that a single regional nation state facing the overwhelming combined naval power of the United States Fifth Fleet can effectively paralyze the arteries of global capitalism. Unless, of course, you understand the mechanical architecture of a dual choke point strategy. That is what we are going to unpack today. Quick disclaimer before we dig deeper. Everything I am going to walk you through is based on publicly available shipping manifests, satellite telemetry, primary diplomatic statements, and public commodities market pricing. I could be wrong. I am going to give you the exact logic, present the data, and I strongly encourage you to challenge my conclusions wherever you spot a gap. That is how rigorous strategic analysis works. All right, let's get into it. To understand why America's energy infrastructure is facing its worst vulnerability in 50 years, you first have to understand the mechanism. How does a nation with a fractional defense budget compared to Washington manage to effectively place a toll booth on global energy transit? I call this framework the Asymmetric Choke-Point Trap. Once you grasp this concept, you will understand why high-tech naval fleets, supercarriers, and guided missile destroyers struggle to solve this specific problem. Here is how the trap functions. Modern global energy trade relies entirely on standardized, predictable, low-cost maritime transit. A supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil is a massive, slow-moving, unarmored steel box. It costs tens of thousands of dollars a day to operate, and its business model relies on absolute predictability. To disrupt that entire system, an adversary does not need to sink dozens of ships. They do not need to defeat the United States Navy in an open ocean fleet battle. They only need to elevate the financial and physical risk of transit past a specific operational threshold. When an adversary deploys low-cost anti-ship ballistic missiles, sea-skimming cruise missiles, and autonomous explosive drone boats along a narrow geographic corridor, they create a severe economic asymmetry. A targeted sea-skimming drone costs roughly $40,000 to produce. The air defense interceptor fired by a U.S. Navy destroyer to destroy that drone costs between $2 million and $4 million. But the economic math gets even worse. If a single commercial tanker is hit, maritime insurance syndicates, most notably Lloyd's of London, immediately skyrocket the war risk premium for any vessel attempting to transit that waterway. If the risk premium rises high enough, ship owners simply refuse to charter their vessels into the zone. So without having to destroy a single naval fleet, the adversary uses asymmetric threat projection to trigger an automated economic blockade. The insurance market does the work for them. The shipping companies pull their fleets back, the oil stops moving, the machine ratchets down. A former senior U.S. Naval War College strategist described this dynamic as operational sea denial without sea control. You don't need to control the ocean, you just need to make it uninsurable for everyone else. And that brings us to the core of what is happening today, to Iran's execution of the dual choke point strategy. Let's break down the first choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the navigable shipping lanes in the strait are only 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. These lanes lie entirely within the territorial waters of Iran and Oman. For decades, Western military planners assumed that maintaining open transit through Hormuz simply required keeping the main sea lanes clear of naval mines and repelling surface warships. What those planners failed to internalize is that Iran has spent 30 years converting its southern coastline into an integrated subterranean anti-access zone. Stretching along the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has embedded hundreds of mobile anti-ship missile launchers, coastal radar units, and fast attack missile craft inside hardened underground bases carved into limestone mountain ranges. Sites along the coastal islands of Kesh, Hormuz, and Larak operate as stationary land-based platforms that cannot be sunk. When the United States increases its naval posture in the Persian Gulf, it brings ultra-expensive assets into a highly confined body of water, dominated by land-based precision artillery and short-range ballistic missiles. If Iran threatens commercial shipping in Hormuz, Western navies are forced to adopt a defensive escort posture. But escorting individual tankers through a 2-mile-wide channel under constant surveillance by land-based missile batteries requires an unsustainable commitment of naval hardware. Now, let's look at the second choke point. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, located over 1,300 miles to the southwest. This is where the strategy reveals its full structural elegance. Historically, if traffic through the Strait of Hormuz was threatened, global markets looked to alternative pipeline routes to bypass the passage. Saudi Arabia operates the east-west crude oil pipeline, capable of moving roughly 5 million barrels of crude per day from its eastern oil fields directly to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. From Yanbu, that crude is loaded onto tankers to sail south through the Bab el-Mandeb toward Asian markets or north through the Suez Canal toward Europe. By coordinating closely with Ansar Allah, the Houthi movement in Yemen, Iran effectively extended its maritime interdiction capability to the Red Sea exit. The Houthis occupy the mountainous coastline commanding the Bab el-Mandeb. Equipped with medium-range anti-ship ballistic missiles, drone technology, and remote-controlled explosive boats supplied through regional supply lines, they command the southern exit of the Red Sea. This creates the dual choke point closure. If an energy exporter attempts to bypass the Strait of Hormuz by piping crude to the Red Sea, those tankers are met at the Bab el-Mandeb by an allied force utilizing the exact same asymmetric tactic. The safety valve is closed, the alternative routing mechanism is rendered equally volatile. Let's look at the financial proof of this strategy in real time. Look at the energy markets right now. Global benchmark Brent crude has spiked past high levels, while West Texas Intermediate follows closely behind. But the key metric isn't just the price per barrel of raw crude. It is the physical freight rates and marine insurance premiums. Tanker charter rates for very large crude carriers operating along western routes have surged dramatically over recent weeks. Insurance underwriters have expanded the designated high-risk zones, forcing energy traders to factor in immense extra costs for every single voyage. Government spokespeople will stand at podiums and tell you that freedom of navigation is fully secured, citing the number of naval patrols and successfully escorted vessels. But apply the simplest real-world test to those statements. Look at global refined fuel markets. If maritime passages were secure, if global supply chains were operating without friction, energy futures would be trading at stable baseline levels, high crude prices, elevated shipping futures, and rising crack spreads. The profit margin between raw crude and refined gasoline are the cold, unspinnable proof that global supply chains are experiencing structural friction. The commodities market does not care about political messaging. The market price is physical reality. Now I want to address the political mechanics behind why this specific moment was chosen for this dual choke point escalation. This is the strategic layer that almost no mainstream news outlet is connecting for you. Energy prices are not just an economic metric. They are a direct, highly sensitive political trigger inside the United States. Unlike European nations or Asian economies that utilize dense public transit networks and heavy fuel taxation to buffer price volatility, the American economy is structurally dependent on low-cost liquid petroleum. When the price of crude oil moves upward, the cost flows directly into the pump price for regular unleaded gasoline across 40,000 service stations in the United States within 7 to 14 days. Every 10-cent increase in the price of a gallon of gasoline acts as an immediate regressive tax on the American consumer, pulling billions of dollars directly out of discretionary spending. It feeds immediately into headline consumer price index calculations, drives up the cost of diesel freight transport for food and goods, and forces central banks to keep interest rates elevated to fight persistent inflation. The strategists designing this dual choke point execution understand the American political calendar perfectly. They know that domestic political stability, presidential approval ratings, and legislative majorities in Washington are directly correlated with national average gas prices. By engineered friction at Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, they turn global energy markets into a direct political weapon targeted at American domestic policy. They force Washington into a brutal dilemma: either commit massive unsustainable military assets to police two separate, highly hazardous maritime corridors indefinitely, or accept a sustained surge in domestic inflation that damages internal political stability. Now let's present the strongest possible counter-argument to this analysis, because you should always test any thesis against the best argument against it. Here is the counter-argument. The United States, alongside its international allies, possesses absolute military air superiority and unprecedented naval power. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve can be tapped to inject millions of barrels of crude into the market to suppress price spikes. Furthermore, the United States is now the world's largest single producer of crude oil and natural gas, producing over 13 million barrels per day domestically. Therefore, America is immune to Middle Eastern maritime blockades. And the Iranian strategic play is an act of desperation that will ultimately collapse under the sheer weight of American industrial capacity and military firepower. That is a coherent common argument. Parts of it are factually true. The United States is indeed a massive domestic oil producer, but here are the three specific operational realities that argument completely fails to address. First, the fallacy of domestic energy independence in a cleared global market. While the United States produces massive volumes of crude oil, American refineries, particularly those along the Gulf Coast, were historically engineered to process heavy sour crude oil, whereas domestic shale production generates light, sweet crude. As a result, America must still import hundreds of thousands of barrels of heavy crude daily while exporting its light domestic production. More importantly, crude oil is a globally fungible commodity. If 20 million barrels a day of Middle Eastern crude are restricted from reaching European or Asian markets, those international buyers immediately start bidding up the price of non-Middle Eastern oil, including American crude. An energy crisis anywhere on Earth instantly becomes an energy price shock in domestic U.S. markets, regardless of how much oil is pumped in Texas or North Dakota. Second, the structural limits of naval escort operations. The United States Navy today operates its smallest total hull count in decades, fulfilling a mandate to provide continuous, end-to-end combat escort for commercial shipping through both the Persian Gulf and the Southern Red Sea. Requires a huge concentration of surface combatants, specifically Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. These vessels face severe operational fatigue, continuous crew strain, and critical depletion of their limited VLS missile magazines. You cannot reload vertical launch systems at sea. A destroyer must return to a friendly port to replenish its air defense interceptors. The operational tempo required to continuously protect commercial shipping against low-cost, high-volume saturation attacks is mathematically unsustainable over an extended time frame. Third, the exhaustion of strategic reserves. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve was heavily drawn down during previous energy disruptions and sits at historically reduced levels. It is a finite tactical buffer, not a permanent structural substitute for 27 million barrels of daily seaborne trade. Tapping the reserve provides temporary psychological relief to the markets for a few weeks, but it does not clear a blocked maritime passage, nor does it lower marine insurance rates for commercial fleet operators. The math does not support the idea that strategic reserves can neutralize a sustained dual choke point interdiction. To truly understand why this strategic play is so difficult to reverse, we have to look deeper at the philosophical model driving it. In international relations, there is a fundamental concept known as the strategy of the asymmetric cost imposition. It dictates that in a conflict between a dominant global superpower and a smaller regional power, the regional power does not need to achieve military victory in a conventional sense. It only needs to alter the cost-benefit equation for the superpower until the ongoing operational cost outweighs any potential political gain. Look at how this functions at the engineering level. When an adversary deploys a $50,000 drone or a $100,000 anti-ship missile toward a commercial vessel, the defending military force must deploy multi-million-dollar interceptors, maintain carrier strike groups at sea at a cost of millions of dollars per day, and endure continuous operational wear on elite hardware. Meanwhile, the global economy absorbs tens of billions of dollars in supply chain delays, increased fuel costs, and rising inflation. The regional actor accepts localized military friction and domestic economic hardship because, in their strategic calculation, preserving their sovereign regional influence and demonstrating the limits of superpower projection is worth the price. The superpower, conversely, is forced to spend vast strategic capital simply to maintain a baseline status quo that is constantly being eroded. This brings us to the core structural reality. The dual choke point action is not an isolated tactical reaction. It is a carefully calculated leverage play designed to force a fundamental reassessment of Western posture in the Middle East. Now, let's move to 3 concrete falsifiable predictions based on this structural framework. Write these down, track them over the coming weeks and months, and hold this analysis accountable against real-world events. Prediction number 1. The global maritime trade structure will formalize a multi-tiered shipping model, leading to a permanent structural premium on energy transport. Over the next 60 to 90 days, despite any official military declarations of secured sea lanes, major international container lines and tanker operators will continue to divert significant percentages of Asia-Europe transit around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. This adds 10 to 14 days of transit time and thousands of miles to each voyage, absorbing global shipping capacity and locking in elevated transport costs. The signal to watch: keep a close eye on the Shanghai Containerized Freight Index and global tanker time charter rates. If those rates remain elevated above historic baselines while governments claim success in the region, it proves that the commercial shipping industry views government de-escalation claims as PR rather than operational reality. Prediction number 2. A major political rift will emerge between Western nations and major Asian energy importers regarding maritime naval posture and diplomatic engagement. Economies like China, India, Japan, and South Korea are vastly more dependent on Persian Gulf crude than the Western Hemisphere is. As the dual choke point dynamic persists, key Asian economies will bypass Western-led naval coalitions to establish independent, direct diplomatic arrangements or separate naval escort protocols to secure their specific energy imports. The signal to watch: monitor official diplomatic communications from Beijing and New Delhi regarding Middle Eastern security, specifically looking for third-party mediation offers or bilateral transit guarantees that operate entirely outside of U.S.-led naval frameworks. Prediction number 3. The United States administration will be forced to quietly execute tactical policy adjustments to increase domestic and regional energy supply while seeking an off-ramp to reduce naval operational commitments before late 2026. Facing domestic pressure over persistent inflation and fuel costs ahead of key political milestones, Washington will issue targeted sanctions waivers or quiet regulatory exemptions to allow specific volumes of restricted international oil to enter global markets, while framing the move as a humanitarian or stabilization measure. The signal to watch: watch for sudden, quiet policy shifts from the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, specifically regarding crude export permissions for secondary regional producers or targeted waivers for international energy shipments. Before we finish, I want to leave you with 4 primary source homework tasks so you do not have to take my word for any of this analysis. First, go to the official website of the United States Maritime Administration and read their commercial maritime advisories for the Persian Gulf and Red Sea region. Look at the exact phrasing they use to describe the operational threat environment to merchant shipping. Second, access the public operational updates from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Look up the specific data on daily transit volumes through the Strait of Hormuz and the el-Mandeb and compare those historical baselines with current seaborne export metrics. Third, look up the public financial filings and rate indicators for major international shipping conglomerates like Maersk and Frontline. Track their official routing announcements regarding the Cape of Good Hope versus direct transit through Middle Eastern choke points. Fourth, open any financial data portal and set up a daily tracker for Brent crude oil futures alongside global marine fuel prices. Use that market data as your daily ground truth for what is actually occurring across global transit lanes. Now, here is the question I want to leave you with today. We are watching tens of billions of dollars spent on high-tech naval deployments, carrier strike groups patrolling thousands of miles of ocean, and continuous air operations, all to protect trade routes that are being disrupted by low-cost asymmetric technology. If the most advanced military force on Earth cannot guarantee low-cost frictionless transit through a 20-mile wide stretch of water without spiking the domestic cost of living for its own citizens, what does that reveal about the true resilience of the globalized economy? Think about that. I'll see you in the next analysis.